Thanks for being here. I'm currently in Jerusalem and Israel with 35 from Suncoast, and we're doing a tour of the Holy Land. But while I was there, I also can be here via technology to talk to you about this next in the teaching that we're in, the Purpose Driven Strife. We started a few weeks ago with the life of Joseph, and we're going to be continuing this until we're finished in week 7. But this is week number 4. Let's start and recap. Week number 1, Joseph was the favorite. Remember the story? He was the one who had this beautiful ornate robe, and he flashed it around, and he made his brothers very annoyed by it. And he also annoyed them by going back to his dad and bringing a bad report to them. So he was the favorite, he was a tattletale, but he was also a dreamer. He told his brothers and his dad, for example, that someday you'll all bow down to me. Pretty arrogant for someone. Try that at a family reunion, see how it goes for you. Not too well, I'm sure. So that was the first week. The second week, we talked about how the dreamer is sent to check up on his brothers. They're taking care of the sheep down south of Jerusalem. And as he went down to find them, he wandered around until finally, as a 17-year-old, someone gave him some direction and he found them. But when they saw him coming, because you could see that coat from a long way, they were so annoyed by him, probably understanding he's going to bring another report back to his dad about how they're not taking care of things the way he thinks they should. When they saw him, they decided to kill him. One of the brothers intervened. They decided, hey, let's don't kill him. He is our brother. So they put him in a cistern, and they sold him when a tribe of Ishmaelites were on the way to Egypt, and they sold him to them for 20 pieces of silver. It's amazing how you can dream big dreams as Joseph did. Sometimes it's best not to tell all your dreams, and others may be annoyed by your dreams, but then the collateral damage of killing a dream is often severe. See, what happened is his brothers, after they sold him into slavery, they took this fancy coat of many colors, this ornate robe. They tore it and they dipped it in goat's blood, and they took it back to his dad, saying, do you know who this belongs to? Jacob, his father, was so distraught. He was so upset about the loss of his son. It was more than his brothers thought. And he said, basically, I will grieve for my son till I go down to the grave. Pretty strong. Pretty tragic, but it really is what happened. And they did not realize he would be so reactive to that, so it brought them a little bit of sorrow along the way. So, meanwhile, back to Joseph. He's in this caravan headed to Egypt. He's in bondage and chains till he gets there, and he's sold to Potiphar. Potiphar is the captain of the guard. And as he was presented to Potiphar, he was first a slave, and everything he touched seemed to do so well that Potiphar decided, this guy needs to run my household. So he ran all of Potiphar's business, and everything was going well for him. Joseph seems to prosper despite his circumstance. But that third week, we also looked at those who sidetracked leaders. There was Potiphar's wife. She saw him as a man, handsome, well-built, and she decided, I'm going to take this guy to bed with me. And he refused her, and she tried daily to seduce him, and he continually refused her. But one day, he went in the house and there was no other slaves there, and she grabbed him by the robe and tried to drag him to bed. As she did, he was saying, no, I'm not going to do this, and he spun out of his robe and ran out the door without his robe. Now, it is interesting when you look about the robes that he wore. The first robe was one that he wore of honor, and it was taken away from him, and in some way, he lost his honor with that robe. The second robe he lost was to keep his honor. He was unwilling to do that. But when Potiphar comes home, his wife says, this Hebrew slave tried to rape me. And Potiphar was so angry. He said, what evidence do you have? I've got his robe. So he threw him into prison. And when he was in prison, he was with a couple of other people, which is the point of our talk today. As we begin to look at what happens in Joseph's life, and we track it over these weeks, we're going to find out the incidents in his life parallel some of the incidents in our lives. That sometimes in our development, it comes from some painful experience in our life. We don't want experiences, though. Most of us that cause strife. I don't know anyone who wants to be put in that circumstance. But life is life, and it has circumstances and difficulties and often strife. We often grow, develop, and become more understanding because of this. When my oldest brother was 39 back in 1985, he took his own life. I can tell you that it was painful. Painful for me, for all my siblings. I don't know anyone it was more painful to than my mother. Something is terrible when you lose a child in some manner. And she lost a son. And what's amazing, I really was not fond of this pain that I was experiencing, but I don't think it was part of God's cosmic plan. And I never blame God for that. We have free will, but life's issues, painful as they are, can either crush us or develop us. And it's our choice. And some people just say, I'm devastated, I'm going to live in devastation. And other people find this resolve somewhere within them to where they really become more because of it. And it transforms them. It doesn't destroy them. When we allow love and grace to work in the midst of chaos, we really have become a Joseph as a part of this story. The story of Joseph is a painful story, but like any life story, it contains heartache. His journey through heartache and injustice takes him to a place of humility where he becomes the hero in the story, which we'll find out later. We're not there. Currently in our story, Joseph is in prison, and he again somehow becomes the favorite. He's watching over now not Potiphar's house, but the warden's house, the prison itself. He's still in prison, but now he's in charge of all the things. And while he's there are two men in prison with him, both from Pharaoh's intimate group of servants. The first one was the cupbearer. The second one was the baker. The cupbearer, who is he in that society? He's one who really stood near Pharaoh a lot of the time because he provided him drink whenever he wanted drink, and that probably was frequent. And often the cupbearer would have to taste it to make sure it wasn't poison. So he had his share of whatever the Pharaoh was drinking. So the cupbearer was continually by Pharaoh. And why he was placed in prison, we really don't know, but we can guess. We can have some scenarios that may be one of the possibilities. One of them may be, hey, I'm the cupbearer, and maybe I've tasted too much of Pharaoh's wine. Maybe I offended Pharaoh by my comments. Maybe I just got too buddy-buddy with Pharaoh because we're drinking buddies. Probably not a good idea. Maybe he was in trouble because in tasting he began to stagger. Maybe he spilled wine all over Pharaoh. Maybe he took his position for granted. Whatever it is, we don't really know, but what we do know, he's in jail because of something. The second prisoner with Joseph was the baker. Now, how did the baker end up in prison? We really don't know, but he's someone who annoyed Pharaoh in some measure. He could have served stale bread. He could have been moldy bread, burnt bread, something to do with food. He would not have been as close to Pharaoh as the cupbearer. Maybe he just didn't have the bread baked on time, and maybe it happened more than once. But regardless, he was in jail along with the cupbearer. In prison, both men were assigned to Joseph, which leads us today to three concepts, and this is the first of three. Number one, often Josephs find themselves surrounded by those who are looking for answers to life's questions. You may be a Joseph. You may be one of those people that people come to you, they really are looking for an answer to some of the issues that are going on in their life. But that's who Joseph was. In this story, these two guys had dreams. Neither man could interpret the other man's dreams, nor his own dream. And when Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw they were kind of dejected and upset and sad, and he listened to their story about their dreams. And here are the dreams. The cupbearer, he said, I have a dream about a vine with 3 branches loaded with clusters of grapes. And I squeezed those grapes into Pharaoh's cup and gave the cup to Pharaoh. Joseph listened and said, hey, here's the interpretation of your dream. Those 3 branches mean 3 days. In 3 days, you'll be restored to your position as cupbearer. Remember me to Pharaoh, though, when you get there. Remember me because I did nothing wrong to be placed here. Don't forget me. See, it's one thing to dream, and it's something else to interpret someone else's dream. So Joseph asked this question, do dream interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. And of course, I asked the question, if the interpretation belongs to God, we need to be very careful when we try to interpret dreams. We become confused when our dreams are unclear. Not all dreams seem to have the same value. Some dreams are more life-encompassing than others. For the cupbearer, the dream was about being restored. For the baker, it's a different dream. Then he told Joseph his dream, and this is what he heard. There were 3 baskets of bread on my head. And while they were there, the birds began eating the bread from the baskets on my head. Now, not very complex dream.
And Joseph said to him, in 3 days, it's not going to go very well for you. Pharaoh's going to have your head. Something's going to happen to you, and it's not going to be good. So one dream with a positive output, one with a negative output, which leads me to the second thought today in your notes. It's this. It's often difficult to remember an insignificant dream and difficult to forget one that is potentially life-changing. Have you ever had a scary dream? You ever screamed in your sleep? Well, I've heard people scream. There was a guy, I heard the story of a guy that he dreamed he was eating a huge marshmallow. And when he woke up, half his pillow was gone. So yeah, maybe that was you. Probably not a good idea. I mean, these dreams that Joseph had, the dreams that Joseph helped these guys understand were frightening. They knew they meant something. They did not know what they meant. Now, there's a lot of psychological analysis today of dreams. Freud, with his great understanding of dreams, a lot of psychologists look and try to find the meanings of dreams. But this is way before those guys showed up. And how is it the main guy in the story, who's the guy who interprets dreams, the point is really not so much the dreams, but the interpreter, how is it that I'm Joseph and you forget me for 2 years? So that's a good question, isn't it? See, some dreams take a few days to fulfill, and others take a lifetime. Pharaoh, though, has a dream. He wakes up, he falls asleep, he has another dream. Well, who's Pharaoh? He is the supreme ruler of all Egypt, and it was a huge dynasty when he was there. Pharaoh, the top guy in the world of that day, has some dreams, and he's troubled by them, which leads me to the last concept today. When the opportunity comes for our situation to change, be ready to step forward and embrace it. See, this is about Joseph. He'd been in the warden's prison for 2 years, in charge of the prison, but still in prison. Finally, the cupbearer remembers him, according to the story. And why he doesn't remember him before that, probably because it was not in his best interest. But notice the dreams of Pharaoh. Pharaoh dreamed 2 dreams. The first was there were 7 fat cows and 7 skinny, ugly cows. Now, I think it's interesting. Fat cows, but skinny, ugly cows. Says something about being skinny. Anyway, the 7 skinny cows ate up the fat cows, and you could not tell they were changed. They didn't change their physical appearance at all. Then he fell asleep. Woke up and had another dream. There were 7 heads of grain growing full on a good single stalk. There were 7 other heads of grain, withered, thin, scorched by the east wind. The 7 thin heads of grain ate up and swallowed the 7 good heads. Pharaoh called all his entourage in, his magicians, his diviners. Please tell me what this means. None of them could interpret it. Why? Because we would be speculating. And we've seen how Pharaoh acts. If you spill wine, he'll throw you in jail. If the bread is a little moldy, he'll throw you in jail. I don't think I want to take that risk. So maybe it was fear, maybe it was risk, whatever it was, but they could not come up with an explanation. And Joseph, after he's called into Pharaoh's presence because of the cupbearer, he approaches Pharaoh and he says, I really can't interpret your dreams, but God can. And God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. I listen to that and I go, boy, that is brilliant. Because it's really not me putting myself on the line. If you don't like the interpretation, blame God. But he also boosts Pharaoh's confidence. Joseph began to understand that God is the source of discernment and insight, and he helps Pharaoh understand God is a source of wisdom and humility. But Pharaoh is such an important person, God has given him some insights to the future. It's not just a simple interpretation. It expands, and it becomes economic. So listen to Joseph's advice. He said, God has shown Pharaoh. See how this works? Not me. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. It's going to be 7 years of great abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. The famine coming 7 years later will wipe out all the abundance. It's going to be really rough on Egypt. It's coming, and it's coming soon. Pharaoh says, what do you suggest? He said, well, I suggest you look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of all of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint county commissioners, maybe state commissioners, whatever they are, but appoint leaders over each province and have them gather 20% of the food every year for 7 years and store it. Because when the famine comes, then we will not be wiped out. We won't starve. And Pharaoh looked at his advisors and said, where can we find somebody like that? Where can we find anyone like Joseph, filled with the Spirit of God with such insight and such wisdom? Then Pharaoh, without asking their advice, he says, I'll tell you, since God has made all this known to you, Joseph, guess what? Since no one is so discerning and wise as you are, you're now in charge of all of Egypt. Now, can I play what if for a second? What if Joseph were wrong? What if Joseph was deceiving? What if he's right? This dreamer, throughout the cycle of life, imprisoned, thrown in the cistern, into bondage, Potiphar's house, the jail, back into the place where he's just appointed over all of Egypt. Is it worth the risk? Here's the thing, he didn't have a choice. If this is what you think, then you're in charge. Joseph's willingness to take a risk had just taken another step forward. Life was going to be so much improved. So here's my question to you. Did the famine happen? What happened to his father and brothers? Would he ever get reunited with his family? Well, we'll talk about that next week. Fair enough? Let me say a prayer for you. Father, thanks for your goodness and grace. Thanks for allowing us to be here. Thanks for the people that come out today. I pray, Father, that they would sense goodness and grace that comes from you. Many of us are like Joseph. We're on this journey in life, highs and lows, but may we be faithful with eyes open, discerning, always to do what's right, filled with integrity and humility. Do your work in our lives, we pray. In Christ's name, amen. Now they're going to change the set, and we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about what's going on.
So I want to start this with something that you told me earlier. You said you ordered something and it arrived today.
Right. One of the things I wanted to do is show a coat of many colors. So I looked online and searched and found one, and finally found it not too far away in Austin, Texas. Little did I know it takes a long time to get anything from Austin, Texas. So I've been waiting for this robe for well over a week, and it arrived today. Right before this talk that I gave, I got an email notification. It's been delivered. So we'll see it when I get back. Yeah, we'll see it when I get back.
Wait, so you will wear it on stage?
I don't know. We'll see.
I would love to see it.
Yeah.
At least just for a moment. So in these stories, do you feel like it's necessary to speculate a little bit? Kind of how you talked about the cupbearer and the baker, what they did wrong. Do you feel like that's helpful or sometimes dangerous when trying to interpret these stories?
Well, I think the stories are meant to be understood as stories. And I think that, they're not 100%, no story is 100% literally perfectly accurate. Some things are always left out of a story. Even the best story you tell, you can't tell every detail. So because of that, sometimes it gives the story a little more life. I want people to see the cupbearer. I want them to see the winemaker, the bread baker, and see what they look like. Maybe in your mind you have one guy that's dressed one way, one guy with a big baker's hat. But the details, I think, are important to help us become part of the story. And that's why I usually try to find segments of the story that we may not think through and try to make them more seeable in our imagination.
Right. Do you feel like that's typical in churches? Is that typical to kind of give your own flair to the story?
That's a good question. And since I've been in the front for all these years and I'm not out there listening to what other guys say, I'm probably not the best person to ask that question. I just know that for me, I think that I want the story to come alive. And it's a very static story unless you help it come alive. And I try to stay honest to the core of the story, but just add details that we might see. I mean, even the robe, the coat of many colors, just the fact that I act like it's flowing around and you kind of pirouette with this robe, you could see that very natural with a 17-year-old just acting up or acting arrogant or like he's something important.
So you almost try to pull these ancient stories into a slightly more modern context? Do you feel like that's difficult?
It's not for me because I try to enter as one of the characters in the story.
in my imagination, I try to be there and see what's going on. And some of that's not just imagination, it's through doing historical research, finding out what the first century is like, what the culture is. And really when you begin to study a passage and get to where you can get behind the culture, and you have to understand Semitic thought, and it's different than Anglo thought. And to try to live from there to here, I think it becomes more genuine and more authentic than me just saying, oh, this means this or this means this. And there's a lot of speculation that people say, the number of fish that were caught in the sea, these numbers mean something. We don't know. I mean, I think that's absurd. But I think what many times they're saying there's a lot or little. And I think these stories about Joseph and his dreams are fascinating.
This is also something that you've kind of seen from different angles too. You can tell the story of Joseph from so many different avenues. And so why this version of the story, talking about his strife, talking about the hardships that Joseph went through? Why is that important to people today?
Well, I think many people go through difficulties. And I mean, we have them even in Suncoast with families going through just traumatic experiences. And sometimes we want to blame God because it gives us at least a purpose for this horrible act. And I think that's inappropriate. I think that we understand that life is full of strife and life has issues. And when we get our understanding in the right order, it allows us to live a more holistic, healthy life. And we quit blaming God or blaming others. We take responsibility where we've been at fault. And even where we've not been at fault, we still take responsibility for the outcomes of the tragedy. So, and I think that's important. And we live through those heartaches. And sometimes you have to pour meaning into something that's difficult so you can make it through. Yeah.
I think what's really cool about this story of Joseph is that he doesn't start out as the quintessential hero. He's not going out there and he's this big, he's not high up and then he falls down like he does. That is kind of that story arc. So why is it that we can put ourselves into that story and gain meaning, even though we're not from that culture? It was so long ago. I mean, his father has multiple wives and he is picked, out of all the brothers as the favorite. These are kind of things that are very, very taboo these days. So how can we just put ourselves into that story and live our lives differently because of how we see it?
No, I think that's a great question. I think that probably the great teaching point is not to have 4 wives. I think that's a good point. I think but the teaching point of seduction and arrogance and aloofness and hatred and despising something, those are all common characteristics to humanity. They're not specific to an era. We still face those today. And dysfunction, I mean, we face a lot of dysfunction today, and we see some of that in Joseph's brothers and their animosity toward him, and even his dysfunction in the way he's treating them. So right. I think those are just common. Teenagers are teenagers, and sibling rivalry is sibling rivalry. And being a favorite, we all, we suffer sometimes from favoritism when it's not us. Mm-hmm. And some words for that have become prejudice. It just gives us a great opportunity to talk about the issues in our lives as well. So I think it all fits. Just you leave the first century stuff behind, but you take the commonalities to humanity and you apply them today.
Can we find the story of Joseph in Hollywood films? Do you feel like that's a formula that's kind of been reused?
I think that the story of a hero, this, we call them the archetypical story, but where a hero comes in and often he has some issues he has to deal with, and there has to be something that he overcomes, and then at the end he does overcome it to a greater good for himself and also those around him. I think that's a standard story in Hollywood, a standard story in Greek mythology. It's a story of humanity. I think it's just very much about being human. And if it's Star Wars, you name it, the story is everywhere.
Right. Now, are there parts of the story that you leave out that you don't necessarily feel require a whole weekend to talk about?
Yeah. There's parts of it that just, I don't think they fit as well, so we leave them out. I mean, in this whole storyline of Genesis passages, in one of the chapters, I think it's 38, it's a digression from Joseph to one of Joseph's uncles, Judah. And there's a whole story in Genesis chapter 38 that digresses from Joseph. Just this interlude, I skip over it because it's just kind of weird. I mean, but
like how?
Well, his uncle Judah, has a bunch of boys, and one of them marries a Canaanite girl by the name of Tamar, and Tamar is this wonderful woman, but her husband dies. In that culture, when the man dies, then this wife marries the brother. So then Judah's second brother marries Tamar, and he dies. And Judah goes, this woman is bad luck.
Yeah.
He's got a third son that's to be promised to her, and he doesn't let her marry him. Meanwhile, the story goes on, and Judah's wife dies, and he goes into town, and he stops by on the way to the temple, sees a temple prostitute. But she knows he's headed there, and Tamar dresses up like a prostitute, and he doesn't even know it's her, and he sleeps with her. Meanwhile, she says, what payment? He says, I'll send a goat for you. He said, no, leave me it's a cord and your stamp or your seal and your staff. Your cord, your seal, and your staff, which is kind of a marker. And that's good for payment till it comes. Well, when he finally sends the goat, she's gone. And he goes, well, let her keep it. Then later on, he finds out that his daughter-in-law, Tamar, is pregnant.
Uh-oh.
And little does he know, he's the dad. Uh-oh. See how you can leave this story out? It doesn't fit
a lot
Joseph.
Of details.
Yeah. So what comes out of it, he comes down to have her stoned to death. And
Whoa.
she says, because she's committed adultery, and she's his daughter-in-law, and she said, well, the man whom I slept with, there's his staff and his cord and his seal. And he says, wow, this woman he used the word righteous. I'd say cunning. She realized that I did not give her my third son, and she played the game, and I can't do anything to her. And she ended up having twins, and that's the end of that story. But it's stuck right in the middle of this Joseph narrative. So you see how you can just skip over that because it's a whole different story in itself. But it is interesting that Tamar, in the genealogy of Matthew, there's only 5 women mentioned in Matthew, and Tamar is one of them. And that's another story for another day, why those women are mentioned in Matthew. So all of them are women of suspect.
Yeah, I like that. Well, you did actually mention twins, which segues perfectly. So you said last week, a lot of times, well, just in general, a lot of times when people tell you stories in the grand hall or give comments, sometimes they do end up making it into the sermon or up on stage. And you had a story from last week about some twins that I would love for you to tell.
Yeah, her name is Sue Ann. She called me in the grand hall. She said, hey, I want to tell you a true story. My uncle was a high school teacher up north. I think it's Minnesota, but up there above Tennessee. But way up there, and her uncle had twins in high school. One of the twins was a high performer. I mean, just excellent academically, and the other not so. He was way behind, and one was smart and one not so smart. So they decided to give the smarter twin the Student of the Month award. But their names were, she said Somali names, but she said one was Abi and one was Abu. And the school accidentally put Abi's name, which is the less intellectual kid, and the other one was forgotten in this moment. And all the family came in because finally, for the first time, this not as smart brother won this award. And it's such accolades. She said it was tremendous. But that kid's life changed, and he became an outstanding academic, all based on the error that he was the student of the month. All the accolades that should have gone to his brother came to him, and he lived up to those, which fit very well in the topic of last week about child development. And, we become who we're proclaimed to be oftentimes. So I thought it was a great story, but it's not uncommon for someone to share a great story like that with me. I love them.
Yeah. And I think it's also comes back to the story, when you read one of these stories like the Joseph story, being able to put yourself into that story. I think if you have a good example of what good decisions can lead to, then it's similar to this twin story. If you say, you're amazing and you're so intelligent and you deserve this reward, and it's kind of like, if you can get that idea into your mind, then it can change. Do you feel like that's what do you think that is? Why does that happen?
Well, I don't know. I mean, but I think that if you're told that you're wonderful your whole life, you begin to believe it. And I think you live up to it. And I think that's part of the tremendous value. Also, with the story from Sue Ann, the other thing I think is really interesting is when someone comes to me with a story, I know that I'm communicating well, because my job is not just to give you information. My job often is to make your mind wander to the application in your life that fits a scenario. So when you do that, so in some ways, a good teaching session is one that makes your mind wander. Right. And you say, well, then mind wanders all the time, but I mean about a particular subject or about a topic, not about what you're going to have for lunch. So
I don't know. I always think about food. So I think the capper to every sermon, which I think a lot of people would find their favorite part, you do a closing story. So I would love it if you would share with me and the small audience here your closing story.
Sure. There was a woman, this is a story, who went to a mall one day, and she went in the store. And when she went in the store, she saw Jesus there at the counter. And she said, wow, you look like some of the pictures of Jesus. Are you Jesus? And he said, yes, I am. So, well, this is amazing. Do you work here? He goes, no, I own the store. She said, wow, how does it work? He said, you can go shop throughout the store, but here's a piece of paper and pencil, write down all the things you want. And she went and she found world peace, getting rid of hunger, no more wars, no more anger, no more violence. She wrote down all the things that she wanted, and she went back to the front. She said, here's my list. He said, oh, that's a great list. And he went down under the counter and shuffled around for a few minutes and came back up, and he put before her 12 packets of seeds. And she said, what are these? He said, these are seeds. She said, no, what I really want is a finished product. He said, you can have it, but it all starts with seeds. And she walked away not buying anything. Because she didn't want to be encumbered by those dreams that would lead to that resolve. But I think that's the story of who Jesus is for us, that he gives us the seeds to make the world a better place. And it can be a better place. And it starts with this understanding that, and I want to plant this seed in everyone's heart, that God loves you, and so do I.
There's the catchphrase.
That's it.
Very nice. Okay, well, I think that concludes it. We'll look for more videos from you from Israel.
It'd be my pleasure.
And you'll get back
Yep.
another weekend.
Yeah, I'll be back sooner or later.
Okay. Whenever you decide.
That's right.